What was the most racist rule at your school? Our principal, Mr. Harris, spent every morning announcement reminding us that speaking any language other than English would result in immediate punishment. One day, he claimed he overheard kids plotting in Spanish, and from that day on, teachers patrolled the hallways, the bathrooms, and even the parking lot listening for anything that wasn't English. One word meant 3 days suspension, plus a note on your permanent record. Mr. Harris loved telling assemblies that English was the language of success. Spanish was all my family spoke at home, so going the whole school day without using a single word of Spanish was exhausting and stressful. My mom stopped coming to school events after a teacher corrected her accent in front of other parents. Kids would hang up on their parents mid-call rather than risk answering in their native language and getting suspended. The Puerto Rican kids, the Vietnamese kids, the Haitian kids, we all walked around like half ourselves, our real voices trapped in our throats. My friend got suspended for calling out to his grandmother in Spanish when she picked him up, and another lost his scholarship for accidentally cursing in French when he stubbed his toe. I kept my phone hidden and silenced because my grandmother, who lived with us and only spoke Spanish, had worsening heart problems. My mom worked at a warehouse 40 minutes away where she couldn't always answer calls, making me the emergency contact. 2 years without a suspension meant I'd perfected the art of swallowing Spanish words before they could escape, even when other kids tried to trick me into responding as a joke. I'd also figured out workarounds that technically didn't break the rule. When my grandmother called during lunch, I'd answer with just mm-hmm and no while she talked in Spanish, making it sound like I was agreeing with someone speaking English nearby. When my grandmother had a minor fall and called during passing period, I had to stand in the bathroom stall, saying nothing but yes and no while she asked me questions, terrified that someone would hear me if I spoke. I tapped out codes we'd developed where 3 taps meant take your medicine and 4 meant call mom instead. It took 15 minutes to make sure she was okay without actually speaking to her, and I was late to chemistry, but at least I hadn't gotten suspended. I thought I could keep managing these situations with creative solutions until graduation. My grandmother knew about the rule and tried to only call for real emergencies, but sometimes she forgot or got confused. We had a whole system worked out where the neighbor would text me first if something was really wrong, and I'd know to step outside school property before calling back. But emergencies don't always follow your careful plans. During history class, my phone vibrated 12 times in my pocket before I finally checked it under my desk. My neighbor only had this number for emergencies with my grandmother, and she'd never called more than twice before. My hands were shaking as I saw the missed calls climbing to 20, then 25. The second our teacher turned to write on the board, I slipped out into the hallway and called back. My neighbor was screaming in Spanish that my grandmother had collapsed and was barely breathing. She couldn't translate the name of my grandmother's heart medication for the paramedics, and they couldn't understand what she was trying to tell them. The medication had a long name that sounded similar to the one she was allergic to, and in her panic, my neighbor kept mixing them up. I tried our tapping system, but she was crying too hard to understand it. I tried typing the medication name in a text, but she couldn't read my screen to the paramedics while holding the phone to her ear. There was no creative solution this time. My grandmother was dying, and I had to choose between her life and my future at this school. I ran down the empty hallway toward the exit, speaking rapid Spanish, explaining exactly where the medication was kept in the bathroom cabinet, 3rd shelf, behind the vitamins, in the white bottle, not the blue one. My neighbor put me on speaker so I could talk to the paramedics, but they didn't speak Spanish either, so I was translating frantically back and forth while running to my car. The medical terms came out in whatever language I could think of them in first, switching between Spanish and English so fast I couldn't track which language I was speaking, just desperate to get the information across about her heart medication and her deadly penicillin allergy, then back to Spanish to calm my neighbor who kept asking if my grandmother was going to die. I was so focused on getting every detail right that I didn't notice Principal Harris standing by the main entrance, watching me speak the forbidden language that could save my grandmother's life. He had his phone out, recording everything, his face completely unreadable. She survived because the paramedics knew not to give her the medication she was allergic to. The doctor said the allergy information I'd translated saved her life, that the wrong medication would have killed her in minutes. The next morning, I walked into first period to find Principal Harris sitting at my teacher's desk with his laptop open. The whole class was dead silent. He turned the laptop toward me, showing security footage from the hallway with clear audio of me speaking rapid Spanish on my phone. "Would you like to explain," he said, pulling out a suspension form with my name already filled in, "why you thought you were exempt from our English-only policy?" My legs felt like concrete blocks stuck to the floor. The whole class stared at me while Mr. Harris tapped his finger on the suspension form that already had my name written in black ink. My mouth went completely dry like I'd been eating sand. He wasn't really asking me anything. He was putting on a show for everyone else. The laptop screen kept playing the security footage on repeat, showing me running down the hall with my phone pressed to my ear. My hands started shaking when I tried to speak. My grandmother was dying and the paramedics couldn't understand which medication would kill her. Mr. Harris held up his hand to stop me before I could explain more. "Emergencies don't override school policy. You could have found another way." His voice stayed perfectly calm, but his eyes looked at me like I was just another problem to file away. The suspension form sat there between us like a guilty verdict that had already been decided before I even walked in. "Can I call my mom to explain what's happening?" He shook his head slowly. "She'll need to speak English during school hours or bring an approved interpreter." The whole class shifted in their seats, but nobody said anything. Even calling for help had rules attached to it. My hands shook harder as I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Mr. Harris opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick packet of papers with yellow highlighter marks all over them. He pushed it across the desk toward me. "Your disciplinary hearing is scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m., and you have the right to bring a parent or guardian, but all proceedings will be conducted in English only." The bell rang and everyone grabbed their bags and rushed out without looking at me. Their eyes stayed glued to the floor or their phones as they squeezed past my desk. Mr. Harris packed up his laptop and walked out, leaving me standing there alone with the packet in my hands. The hallway was already filling up with kids heading to second period when I finally made my legs move. Whispers followed me down the hall like a swarm of bees. Some kids pulled out their phones to text while staring at me. Others made jokes loud enough for me to hear about getting sent sent to Spanish jail. My face burned hot, but I kept walking and tried to look like I didn't care. The weight of what just happened pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Before I could get to my next class, the office secretary appeared in the hallway and told me to follow her. She led me to the administrative office and pointed at a hard plastic chair near the window. "You're excused from classes today, but you must remain here until dismissal." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making my head hurt. I pulled out my phone to text my neighbor about my grandmother. My fingers fumbled over the keyboard as I typed, asking if she was okay after yesterday's emergency. The thought of her being alone at home made my stomach twist into knots. The secretary handed me a form and told me to write my official statement about the incident. The blank lines stared back at me. Everything sounded wrong when I tried to explain life and death situations in formal English. I kept starting over because my grammar mistakes made me look guilty of something worse than speaking Spanish. The secretary watched me struggle without offering any help. Her eyes followed my pen as I crossed out another sentence and started again. The words wouldn't come out right, no matter how many times I tried. After my 5th attempt, I asked if I could get a copy of Mr. Harris's recording from the hallway. The secretary didn't even look up from her computer. That's internal evidence that students can't access. My stomach dropped like I was falling off a cliff. They had proof I couldn't even see or respond to properly. The unfairness made my jaw clench so tight my teeth hurt. Another student sitting across from me waiting for something leaned over and whispered that the hallway cameras have audio recording. I hadn't known that before. My brain started racing as I pulled out a notebook and started writing down exact times and locations. I tried to remember who else was in that hallway when I ran past. Maybe someone else saw the emergency written all over my face. Maybe they heard me crying as I ran. Interesting conversation happening here. I wonder what they're really thinking. The other student got called into the counselor's office before I could ask more questions. My phone buzzed with a text from my friend saying people were already spreading rumors. They were saying I planned to break the rule on purpose to make some kind of political statement. The lie was spreading faster than I could possibly correct it. More texts came in asking if I was trying to be some kind of hero or if I just wanted attention. I felt sick knowing how twisted the story was already becoming. My thumb hovered over the reply button, but I couldn't think of what to say that would make any difference. I turned off my phone notifications and shoved it deep in my backpack. The secretary kept typing on her computer while I sat there with a half-finished statement form in my lap. The clock on the wall moved so slowly, I thought it might be broken. Other kids walked past the office window and stared at me like I was an animal in a zoo. Some pointed and whispered to their friends. The form still sat there mostly blank because nothing I wrote could capture what really happened. How could I explain in perfect English grammar that my grandmother's life mattered more than their stupid rule? My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a text from my neighbor saying my grandmother was stable but really weak and kept asking for me in Spanish over and over. The relief hit me so hard I had to grab the desk, but then the guilt came right after because I should have been there with her instead of sitting in this stupid office. She probably didn't understand why I wasn't home yet, and that made my chest hurt. I shoved the form back across the desk unsigned and walked out while the secretary called after me that I couldn't leave without permission. The halls were empty during class time, and my footsteps echoed as I headed to my locker to grab my stuff. A note taped to my locker said the guidance office had scheduled me an appointment tomorrow morning with Orlando Frey, some counselor who supposedly helped bilingual students with these situations. Maybe someone in this building actually understood what we were going through, but I wasn't holding my breath. That evening, while Mom and I sat at the kitchen table trying to eat dinner, an email popped up on my phone with the official hearing details. 3-day suspension, permanent record notation, and review of my enrollment status. My hands went cold when I read those last 2 words because they could actually kick me out of school for this. Mom read it over my shoulder, and her face went white as she grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. The next morning, I showed up early for my appointment with Orlando Frey, who turned out to be this quiet guy with glasses who actually listened instead of just talking. He explained that the school had broad authority, but there were district policies about discrimination they might be violating with this English-only rule. He couldn't promise anything would help, but he gave me a list of what to document and how to present it at the hearing. His office felt safer than anywhere else in the school had felt in 2 years. During lunch, I called the hospital from the parking lot and asked if they could send letters from the ER doctor and paramedics about how my translation prevented a fatal medication error. The administrator said she'd try, but it might take a few days to get everything on official letterhead and have the right people sign it. I wrote down her name and direct number in case I needed to follow up. My phone started blowing up with notifications because someone had posted about my situation on social media, and now everyone had opinions. Half the comments said rules are rules, and I knew what would happen. The other half said saving a life matters more than any stupid policy. The notifications made me dizzy, so I deleted the apps off my phone because I didn't want to be anyone's political symbol or debate topic. After chemistry, my teacher asked me to stay behind, and once everyone left, she quietly admitted the language policy felt wrong, but teachers could lose their jobs for speaking up about it. She pointed to a page in the student handbook showing the district's own non-discrimination language that seemed to contradict the English-only rule. Her hands shook a little as she showed me where to find it online and told me to make copies. That evening, a guy named Ruben Guidry from some legal aid group called after my mom reached out to them for help. He explained that Title VI protects language minorities, but schools often claim safety exceptions to get around it. Any federal complaint would take months to process, way past graduation, so the system moved slower than my life did. The next morning, I went to the main office and requested a Spanish interpreter for my hearing, since my mom struggled with formal English and legal terms. The secretary said they don't provide interpreters for disciplinary hearings, only for special education meetings, and I made sure to write down her exact words. Mike Fair, the assistant principal, pulled me aside in the hallway and suggested I just take Saturday detention instead of fighting this whole thing. He looked tired, like he'd had this conversation before, and knew exactly how it would end for kids like me. The easy path tempted me for about 2 seconds before I remembered my grandmother's face when the paramedics were trying to help her, and nobody could understand what she needed. I told Mike thanks, but no thanks, and kept walking to class. The rest of the week crawled by with teachers looking at me weird and kids whispering when I walked past. Some of them tried to talk to me in Spanish as a joke, joke to see if I'd respond and get in more trouble. I kept my mouth shut and my head down, counting the days until the hearing. My grandmother called twice, but I let it go to voicemail because I couldn't risk anyone hearing me speak Spanish on the school property again. Mom took time off work she couldn't afford to help me prepare for the hearing, going through the handbook and printing out everything Orlando had suggested. We stayed up late organizing documents and practicing what I would say in English, even though it felt wrong explaining in English why speaking Spanish saved a life. The morning of the hearing, my stomach hurt so bad I could barely eat breakfast, but Mom made me try anyway. My phone buzzed with an email notification while I was getting my papers together. The scholarship committee had sent a message about reviewing all disciplinary records before making final decisions. My hands went cold reading that they'd be checking my permanent record next week. This wasn't just about missing 3 days of school anymore. 4 years of straight A's and perfect attendance could mean nothing if that suspension went through. I shoved the phone in my pocket and grabbed my backpack, trying not to think about how college might disappear because I spoke Spanish to save my grandmother's life. The hearing was set for 2 o'clock, but first I had to get through a whole school day. At lunch, I got a text from Mom that my grandmother was released from the hospital. She needed someone watching her constantly now and checking her medications every 4 hours. I spent the rest of lunch period setting up phone alarms and texting our neighbor about check-in times. The chemistry test was tomorrow and I hadn't studied at all. Everything felt like it was piling up at once. During study hall, an email from Ruben popped up on my laptop. He'd been researching and found that recording hallway audio might violate state privacy laws, but he also said courts usually gave schools lots of power for safety reasons. Every legal argument had a counter-argument that helped the school. The whole system seemed set up to protect them, not us. My phone vibrated with a text from a classmate I barely knew. She'd sent a shaky video that showed Principal Harris standing by the entrance with his personal phone pointed right at me while I was on my emergency call. This wasn't just security cameras catching something by accident. He'd deliberately recorded me himself, like he'd been waiting for me to mess up. I forwarded the video to Orlando right away, my fingers shaking with anger. That night I stayed up making a timeline of everything that happened. Orlando came over and helped me write down every single timestamp and detail I could remember. He kept crossing out parts where I wrote how I felt and made me stick to just the facts. The times, the places, who said what, who was there. No opinions, no emotions, just cold, hard facts that nobody could argue with. Working on it actually helped calm my nerves a little. The next day during lunch, I walked around quietly asking Vietnamese and Haitian kids about their experiences with the language rule. Most were scared to talk, but a few wrote anonymous statements for me. One girl lost her National Honor Society spot after answering her mom's call in Vietnamese. A Haitian boy's parents stopped coming to his games because they were afraid of speaking French by accident. The stories kept coming, each one showing the same pattern of fear and lost opportunities. After school, I collected more statements, and the picture got bigger and uglier. That evening, I sat at my computer typing up a formal grievance to the district. I cited discrimination and denial of interpreter services, using all the legal terms Orlando had taught me. My hands shook as I attached all the evidence and hit send. There was no taking it back now. I was officially a troublemaker in their system. The next morning, Principal Harris started showing up everywhere I went. He was in the hallway when I got to my locker. He walked through the cafeteria right when I sat down. He even stood near the bathroom when I needed to go. Each time I saw him, I texted Orlando the time and location, keeping a record of everything. The surveillance made it hard to breathe, like the walls were closing in. During lunch, my phone rang with Mom calling. School cares more about catching kids speaking Spanish than actually teaching them chemistry. Priorities so backwards they could win a gymnastics medal for that twist. Her boss had told her that if she missed any more work for school meetings, he'd cut her hours. We needed every dollar she made to pay for my grandmother's new medications. I told her not to come to any more meetings, but she refused. She said she wasn't letting me face this alone no matter what it cost us. Before chemistry class, my chest got so tight I couldn't breathe right. The room started spinning and I had to grab the desk to stay standing. The nurse said it was a panic attack and asked if I wanted to call someone to help me calm down. I sat there shaking, too scared to speak Spanish even to make myself feel better. They'd made me afraid of my own voice, afraid of the words that lived in my throat since I was born. That evening after Mom got home from work, Ruben called our house and spent an hour walking us through our options. He kept saying we should send a formal notice to the district's legal counsel about Title VI violations, which had something to do with discrimination based on national origin. He typed up a draft while we were on the phone, reading parts out loud so we could understand what we were signing. The legal words made my head hurt, but Mom nodded along, taking notes on the back of an envelope. Ruben warned us that going to the media might make things worse because the school could dig in harder just to prove they weren't backing down. Every choice felt like it could blow up in our faces. The district sent their response to my interpreter request the next morning. 3 paragraphs of nothing wrapped in fancy words. They said they'd review the policy but couldn't provide an interpreter for tomorrow's hearing, which was basically their way of saying tough luck. I went through the email with a highlighter, marking every vague phrase that didn't actually promise anything. The whole thing felt designed to wear people down until they gave up fighting. I spent that whole afternoon practicing my statement for the hearing, recording myself on my phone over and over. The medical terms kept coming out in Spanish first because that's how I'd learned them from helping my grandmother with her prescriptions. I had to force myself to say cardiac medication instead of medicina cardiaca, and my tongue felt thick and clumsy. My own mouth felt like it was betraying me, refusing to cooperate when I needed it most. The morning before the hearing, I checked my email to find a message from the hospital with an attachment. The doctor who'd treated my grandmother had written a brief letter on official hospital letterhead stating that my translation had prevented a potentially fatal medication error. Seeing it written out with his signature at the bottom made it real in a way that nothing else had. This piece of paper proved I'd saved her life, and holding it felt like putting on armor before a battle. During lunch, I met with a classmate I trusted to go over the anonymous statements from other families. Parents had written about their kids getting suspended for answering their phones in their native language, about missing important family news because they were too scared to take calls at the school. We practiced reading them out loud, keeping our voices steady and our faces neutral so nobody could guess whose stories these were. Building this small network of people willing to help felt like we were building something bigger than just just my case. Orlando called that afternoon to suggest copying the district equity officer on all the hearing materials. He said creating an official record beyond just the school would matter if this went further, which seemed to mean if we had to sue. I spent an hour scanning every document, every email, every piece of paper that showed what had happened. The stack of evidence kept growing thicker, each page another piece of proof that this wasn't just about me. Mike Fair showed up at my house that evening with what he called a final offer. If I signed a paper agreeing not to discuss the policy publicly, they'd reduce my punishment to just detention instead of suspension. The paper sat on our kitchen table while he explained how this would make everything go away, how I could move on without any permanent mark on my record. For a second, I almost reached for the pen because I was so tired of fighting, but signing would mean staying quiet while other kids kept suffering. I told him no thank you and watched him fold the paper back into his briefcase with a disappointed look. My phone started blowing up with messages from other students who'd heard about the hearing and wanted to organize a walkout to support me. They were ready to risk their own futures to stand up for what was right, but I couldn't let them do that. I sent message after message asking them not to risk suspension or losing scholarships because of me. This was my fight to finish, and I wouldn't drag anyone else down with me. That night, my grandmother sat with me in the kitchen, not really understanding why everyone was so upset, but knowing something big was happening. She told me in Spanish to speak the truth tomorrow, even if it cost me everything. That truth was more important than their rules. I wrote her words down in English on an index card to read at the hearing, her voice giving me strength even in translation. Family mattered more than any policy they could make up. The next morning, I stood in the same bathroom stall where I used to tap out codes to avoid speaking Spanish, where I'd hidden so many times to protect myself from their rules. Looking at myself in the scratched mirror above the sink, I decided I was done hiding who I was. Tomorrow at the hearing, I would speak clearly in English about why both languages made me whole, why taking away half my voice was like cutting out half my heart. The decision brought a strange calm, like finally putting down something heavy I'd been carrying for too long. The morning came too fast with my alarm going off at 6:30. I texted Orlando to confirm he was still coming and got back a thumbs up emoji. My hands shook while I made coffee and tried to eat toast that tasted like cardboard. The stack of papers I'd printed sat on the kitchen table next to the hospital letter and the anonymous statements from other families. Mom came out of her room already dressed in her best work clothes, the ones she saved for parent-teacher conferences. She looked at the papers and nodded, then started making eggs, even though neither of us felt like eating. Orlando showed up at 7:45 wearing a button-down shirt I'd never seen him in before. We went over the plan one more time while Mom listened and asked questions about who would be there. I explained about Mike Fair being the student advocate and how the district would send someone too. Orlando practiced saying medical terms in English in case he needed to help translate anything important. My phone rang while we were reviewing and I saw it was my neighbor calling. She needed to know if my grandmother should take her morning medication with food or without. I explained in clear English that the white pills went with breakfast, but the pink one was for bedtime. The words came out smooth and easy when I wasn't worried about someone listening and judging every syllable. After I hung up, Orlando pointed out how different I sounded when I wasn't scared of getting in trouble. Mom squeezed my shoulder and we gathered up all the papers. I made 2 copies of everything in case they tried to keep the originals. The walk to the school felt longer than usual with Mom beside me and Orlando trailing behind. Other kids stared as we passed, but I kept my eyes forward. The main office secretary looked surprised to see us and pointed toward the conference room down the hall. The door was already open and I could see the long table set up inside. Principal Harris sat at the head with his laptop open and a stack of folders beside him. Mike Fair was to his left with a yellow legal pad and pen. A woman I didn't recognize sat across from Mike with a district badge on her lanyard. The teacher representative turned out to be my sophomore English teacher, who gave me a small nod when we walked in. There was no interpreter, even though I'd requested one in my grievance paperwork. Orlando took the chair behind me while Mom sat to my right. The room smelled like coffee and copy paper. Principal Harris didn't look up from his laptop for a full minute after we sat down. When he finally did, his face was completely neutral, like we were discussing attendance numbers instead of my future. He turned the laptop screen toward me and hit play on the security footage. The hallway video showed me running while talking on my phone, my mouth moving fast as I switched between languages. The audio was clear enough to hear every Spanish word I'd said to my neighbor and the paramedics. He let it play for 3 minutes before stopping it and pulling out a suspension form with my name already typed at the top. He stated that the evidence clearly showed willful defiance of school policy regarding English-only communication on the school property. I kept my voice steady and confirmed that yes, I had spoken Spanish in the hallway that day. I explained about my grandmother's heart condition and the medication mix-up and how the paramedics needed exact information to save her life. My hands were shaking under the table, but I kept them flat against my thighs. Principal Harris wrote something on his form while I talked. I pulled out the hospital letter and slid it across the table toward the district representative. She picked it up and read it carefully while Principal Harris said the letter didn't change the fact that I'd broken a clearly stated rule. He said policies existed for a reason, and making exceptions would undermine the entire system. The district woman asked to keep the letter and made her own notes on a tablet. I handed her the stack of anonymous statements from Vietnamese and Haitian families describing how the rule affected them. The way she practices saying cardiac medication instead of medicina cardiaca shows how our brains store different kinds of knowledge in different languages. How does forcing someone to translate medical terms they learned in Spanish actually help anyone? One family had missed a funeral because they couldn't coordinate childcare without being able to speak their language. Another had a child who wet himself because he was afraid to ask for the bathroom in Vietnamese when he forgot the English word. The district woman's eyebrows went up as she read through them. Principal Harris's jaw got tighter with each page she turned. Mike Fair asked if I had any additional documentation, and I pulled out screenshots of the state education codes about language access. Mom's phone rang and she fumbled to answer it on speaker when Mike suggested she could provide context about our family situation. Her English came out choppy as she tried to explain about working at the warehouse and my grandmother living with us. When she got stuck on a word, Orlando leaned forward and whispered it to me, and I repeated it louder so everyone could hear. Mom talked about Miss missing school events because teachers made fun of her accent and how she worried every day about me getting suspended for helping with my grandmother. Her voice cracked when she said she was proud of me for saving my grandmother, even if it meant getting in trouble. The district woman typed faster while Mom talked. Mike Fair cleared his throat and suggested that if I withdrew my district grievance, they could reduce the suspension to just 1 day instead of 3. I shook my head and said I wanted the policy reviewed instead of any deals about punishment. I kept my tone respectful, but didn't back down when he pressed about being reasonable. Principal Harris said I was being deliberately difficult and that actions had consequences. The district woman looked between Principal Harris and Mike Fair before saying she thought any disciplinary decision should wait until the district could review its language access policies more thoroughly. Principal Harris's face turned red as he insisted that school-level decisions didn't require district approval for standard disciplinary actions. The district woman reminded him that civil rights complaints went through different channels than regular discipline issues. They went back and forth using careful professional language while my fate hung in the air between them. After another hour of back and forth, they finally reached their decision. The district woman typed something on her laptop while Principal Harris sat there with his arms crossed, looking mad. She turned the screen toward me, showing the official ruling that I'd get 1 day of in-school suspension starting tomorrow. My record would be flagged as under review, and the district would look into their interpreter policies for emergency situations. It wasn't winning or losing, but something in between that nobody was happy about. I signed the paper without saying anything because there was nothing left to say. The next morning, I reported to the small room near the main office where they kept suspended kids. The room had 3 desks facing the wall and no windows. I sat there doing worksheets while missing my chemistry lab where we were supposed to be doing the titration experiment that counted for 10% of our grade. My teacher had already said there were no makeup labs allowed, so my grade dropped from an A to a B just like that. During lunch, I ate alone in that room while the monitor watched me from her desk. Some kids walked by the door on their way to the cafeteria, and I saw a few nod at me through the small window, but others were whispering and pointing. One girl mouthed that I got off easy, while another shook her head like I'd caused too much trouble for nothing. The social cost was becoming clear as I sat there with my sandwich getting soggy. That evening, I went straight to my grandmother's room, where she was sitting in her chair watching her Spanish soap opera. She asked me about school, but I just told her it was fine, and sat next to her on the floor leaning against her chair. We watched the show together without talking about what happened at the hearing, because she didn't need to know what speaking Spanish cost me at that school. She ran her fingers through my hair like she used to when I was little, and we shared that quiet comfort without needing any words at all. 3 days later, I got an email forwarded from my mom that the district had sent to all staff about starting a limited inquiry into language access practices at schools. Walking through the hallways that week felt different, because conversations would stop when I passed, and some teachers seemed nervous when they saw me, like they were worried I might report them for something. My English teacher, who used to joke around with me now, kept our interactions strictly professional. Being right about the policy didn't mean being welcome in the building anymore. 2 weeks after the hearing, a memo went out announcing an emergency exception for language use during medical or safety situations and requiring schools to honor interpreter requests for parent meetings. Principal Harris called an assembly to explain that the new rules only applied to documented emergencies and regular school communication still had to be in English. He stood at the podium reading from the memo in the most narrow way possible, but it was still progress, even if it was small. The scholarship committee sent me a letter saying they were deferring their decision until my final record status was clear, which left me stuck, not knowing if I'd have money for college or not. I wrote them careful updates every week talking about my grades and activities without mentioning the suspension directly, but focusing on my academic performance while the review continued. Waiting for their answer became its own kind of punishment because I couldn't make any college plans without knowing if I had that scholarship. I submitted an op-ed to the school paper about what it felt like to walk around half-voiced without being able to speak your native language. I described the feeling of words getting stuck in your throat and having to translate your thoughts before speaking them without naming anyone specific or mentioning the suspension. After it got published, other kids started coming up to me quietly saying it captured exactly what they felt too. The Vietnamese kid from my math class showed me where he'd highlighted parts that matched his experience, and the Haitian girl from band said she'd sent it to her parents. Words on paper felt safer than words in hallways where someone might report you. The last week of school, I passed Principal Harris in the hall on my way to history class. We didn't acknowledge each other, but I didn't look away either, and neither did he. I kept walking to class, still careful with my words, but no longer silent about things that mattered. The fight wasn't over, but I was still standing, and sometimes that's enough to keep the small resistance going. Thanks for letting me explore all these questions with you today. It's been really interesting wondering about things together. Until next time, like the video, it helps more than you think.